The wind howled through the pines, a mournful wail that seemed to carry the weight of the forest's secrets. My yard, a modest patch of earth at the edge of the Cascades, was cloaked in the golden haze of late autumn, where the last stubborn leaves clung to their branches like reluctant farewells. I'd grown accustomed to the quiet here, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy quilt, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. But that evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, something shattered that stillness. A sound so faint, so desperate, it might have been a trick of the wind. It wasn't. I stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking against the weathered wood, and squinted into the fading light. There, near the old cedar stump I'd never gotten around to pulling, were two small shapes, huddled together like crumpled shadows. Bobcat cubs. Their fur was matted, their ribs sharp against their sides, and their eyes, those wide amber eyes, gleamed with a mix of fear and exhaustion. They weren't moving much, just trembling, their tiny bodies collapsing into the grass as if the earth itself were pulling them down. My heart lurched. I'd seen bobcats before, fleeting glimpses of tawny ghosts slipping through the trees, but never like this. Never so fragile, so broken. I crouched low, keeping my distance, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The cubs didn't react, too weak to flee or hiss. Starving, I thought, the word heavy in my mind. The forest had been unusually quiet this season. The deer scarce, the rabbits even scarcer. Whatever had happened to their mother, she wasn't here now. These cubs were alone, and they were dying. I stood, my mind racing. I couldn't just leave them. But what do you do with wild things that don't belong in your world? Call wildlife rescue? Hope they'd make it through the night? I glanced back at the house, its warm lights spilling out like a promise of safety, and then back at the cubs. Their shallow breaths were barely audible now, and the smaller one's eyes had started to flutter shut. Time was slipping away. That's when I saw him. He emerged from the shadowed tree-line like a specter, silent and deliberate, his movements fluid despite the tension in his frame. A male bobcat, larger than I'd expected. His coat a patchwork of tawny brown and black, dappled with scars that told stories of battles won and lost. His eyes locked onto mine, not with aggression but with something else. Something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Intelligence. Purpose. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He just watched me, his gaze steady, unyielding, as if he were measuring my soul. I froze, my heart pounding. He was close enough that I could see the frost on his whiskers, the faint tremor in his flanks. He wasn't starving, not like the cubs, but he was lean, his body honed to a predator's edge. Slowly, he turned his head toward the cubs, and a low, guttural sound rumbled from his throat. Not a growl, but something softer, almost mournful. He stepped forward, his paws silent on the grass, and nudged the larger cub with his nose. The cub stirred, letting out a weak mewl, but didn't rise. I don't know why I didn't move. Maybe it was the weight of his gaze, or the way he seemed to carry the forest itself in his stride. But I stayed rooted, watching as he circled the cubs, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching, and then, without warning, he turned and bounded back into the trees. The darkness swallowed him whole. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The cubs were still there, still alive, but barely. I needed to act. I started toward the house to grab a blanket, maybe some water, when I heard it. A rustling, heavier this time, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic thumping. I turned, and there he was again, the male bobcat, dragging something through the grass. My breath caught. It was a rabbit, freshly killed, its body limp but still warm, blood glistening on its fur. He dropped it beside the cubs and stepped back, his eyes flicking to me once more before settling on his young. The larger cub stirred first, its nose twitching at the scent of blood. It dragged itself toward the rabbit, its movements sluggish but determined. The smaller one followed, weaker, its tiny body trembling with effort. They tore into the carcass with a desperation that was both heartbreaking and fierce, their small teeth ripping at the flesh. The father watched, motionless, his eyes never leaving them. I should have been afraid. A wild predator so close, so unafraid of me. But fear wasn't what I felt. It was something else. Something like awe, mixed with a strange, aching sadness. This wasn't just instinct. This was something more, something I couldn't name. As the cubs ate, the father turned his gaze back to me. For a moment, I thought he might approach, might acknowledge me in some way. But instead, he let out a low, rumbling call, so soft it barely reached my ears, and then he was gone again, vanishing into the forest like a shadow dissolving into dusk. I stood there, the cold seeping into my bones, watching the cubs devour their meal. They were stronger now, their movements less faltering, their eyes brighter. But questions burned in my mind. Why had he brought the rabbit? Why had he looked at me like that? And most of all, why hadn't he stayed? The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and blood, and I knew this wasn't over. The forest was watching, and something told me the father would be back. The night deepened, the stars piercing the sky like cold, unblinking eyes. The cubs, bellies full for the first time in who knows how long, curled into each other beside the cedar stump, their breathing steadier but still fragile. I'd brought a blanket from the house, an old quilt my grandmother had stitched, and draped it loosely over them, careful not to touch their trembling forms. The air was sharp with frost, and I couldn't shake the image of those amber eyes, the father's eyes, burning into me like a question I didn't know how to answer. I sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee gone cold in my hands, watching the tree lean, waiting for what I wasn't sure. The forest was alive with whispers, crickets, distant owls, the creak of branches bending under the weight of the wind. But beneath it all was a silence that felt like anticipation, like the world holding its breath. I kept replaying the father's movements in my mind. The way he'd dragged the rabbit, deliberate and unafraid. The way he'd looked at me, not as a threat but as something else. A witness, maybe, or a partner in a pact I hadn't agreed to. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had a way of slipping in the dark. The cubs stirred occasionally, their soft whimpers cutting through the night. I was about to head inside, to call the wildlife rescue hotline I'd scribbled on a scrap of paper, when I heard it. A low, guttural cry, not from the cubs but from the forest. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it carried a weight that made my skin prickle. I stood, my eyes straining against the shadows. He emerged again, the father bobcat, his silhouette sharper now under the moonlight. But he wasn't alone. Another shape moved beside him, smaller, leaner, its gait uneven. As they drew closer, I saw her. A female bobcat, her fur dull and patchy, one hind leg dragging slightly as if it had been broken and never quite healed. Her eyes, though, were fierce, glinting with a fire that belied her weakened state. The mother, she was alive. My heart stuttered. I'd assumed she was dead, lost to whatever had left the cubs starving. But here she was, limping toward her young, the father at her side. He carried another kill, this time a small squirrel, its body dangling from his jaws. He dropped it near the cubs, but his focus wasn't on them. It was on her. He nudged her gently, guiding her toward the cubs, who stirred at the scent of fresh blood. The mother hesitated, her body trembling, then lowered herself beside them. The cubs, sensing her presence, let out soft, eager cries and pressed against her, their tiny noses burying into her fur. I watched, motionless, as she licked their heads, her tongue slow but deliberate, cleaning the dirt and blood from their coats. The father stood guard, his eyes scanning the darkness, occasionally flicking to me. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was a warning. This is my family. Stay back. I did, my breath shallow, my mind reeling. The mother was too weak to hunt, that much was clear. The father had been providing for all of them, her, the cubs, this fragile thread of survival woven through the forest's cruelty. But the story wasn't over. As the mother nursed the cubs, her strength visibly waning, the father turned and trotted back toward the trees. I thought he was leaving again, retreating to the shadows as he had before. But then I heard it, a rustling heavier this time, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic scraping. He returned, dragging something larger, something that made my stomach twist. It was no rabbit or squirrel. It was a raccoon, its body limp but massive, its fur matted with blood. The kill was fresh, but the father's flanks heaved with effort, his breath ragged. This wasn't an easy hunt. He'd fought for this, risked himself for it. He dropped the raccoon beside the mother, who lifted her head, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, they held each other's gaze, a silent exchange that felt almost human. Then she tore into the carcass, her hunger overriding her exhaustion. The cubs, too, joined her, their small teeth working alongside hers. The father didn't eat. He stood watch, his body taut, his ears swiveling at every sound. I realized then what had left me speechless. It wasn't just the father's strength or his cunning. It was his devotion, his refusal to let the forest claim his family. He wasn't just hunting for them. He was carrying them, all of them, through a world that offered no mercy. And yet he'd trusted me in his own way. He'd brought the cubs to my yard, left them where he knew they'd be safe, where I could see them. He'd let me witness this, as if I were part of the story. The mother finished eating, her strength returning in small, visible ways, her head held higher, her movements less labored. The cubs, too, seemed stronger, their eyes brighter, their bodies less frail. The father finally relaxed, his shoulders easing as he lay down a few feet away, his gaze still vigilant but softer now. The family was together, whole at least for this moment. I backed toward the house, my boots soft on the grass, not wanting to disturb them. The quilt still lay over the cubs, a small piece of my world woven into theirs. As I reached the porch, the father's head turned, his eyes meeting mine one last time. There was no fear, no challenge, just a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that neither of us could name. I closed the door behind me, the warmth of the house enveloping me, but my mind stayed in the yard, with the bobcats and their fragile, fierce survival. The forest would test them again, I knew, but for now they had each other, and somehow, impossibly, they had me.